Hello and welcome to Racing News 365 answers your fan questions from last weekend's Las Vegas Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, answering your questions is myself, Nick Golding, and 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Absolutely Coop. Sam, we've got some brilliant questions, and I'm not surprised given by just how much happened in Las Vegas, and of course the big thing being Max Verstappen becoming a four-time world champion. But actually, the first question, and apologies in advance if I get any of these names wrong, my pronunciation skills do need massively improving. But the first question comes from Jid, and actually it's to do with a driver that finished second. How good is Lewis Hamilton right now at his age, and should Ferrari be happy that he is joining them next season?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's a very good one. And I think it allows us to kind of get into what I feel is the best and worst of Lewis at the moment. And that is, you obviously saw all weekend he was up there. Him and George were dominating in Vegas. The cold conditions really working for the Mercedes W15. But when it came to crunch time in qualifying in Q3, Lewis couldn't get a clean lap off. And he struggled with qualifying all year. And it's a real bugbear. And that ultimately was probably what cost him victory, because he seemed to have the measure on George on race day. And you saw that how he worked through the field, was able to then start closing in on George with a older set of tyres. And actually, Andrea Stella was talking about this kind of virtuous cycle with Vegas, where the more heat you get in, the better it is. And it's, not necessarily about how good the car is, but more about the relationship between the car, the tyres, and the tarmac. Anyway, this is a very long way of saying that I think Lewis is still very, very good. Ferrari absolutely will be pleased. They wouldn't have signed him otherwise. And yes, signing a driver a year out is always a risk, especially when you're 39 going on 40.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as I was alluding to, Vegas highlights the areas where Lewis is maybe weaker than he used to be. He just hasn't quite got to grips with qualifying under the contemporary ground effect era. And that is something that probably will concern Ferrari. You've got Charles Leclerc, who's brilliant over a lap. So you're going to have in some ways, a bit of an odd lineup where you expect Charles will have a similar effect to George. So yeah, in short, I think he's still brilliant and Ferrari are happy. But yeah, we have to really kind of see how things go once he gets back into what we hope will be a title-winning car for F1's sake, that is.
And that'll be interesting because actually Lewis, arguably at least the last couple of years, hasn't been the same consistent race killer that he became known to be with Mercedes, obviously, during their dominant phase. I think that's going to be the really interesting thing. But great answer. And thank you very much, Gerd, for your question. This next one, Sam, I think we can both answer because it comes from Renz. And it's, can we say that this title, the 2024 driver's title, is Max Verstappen's best from his four? And actually, we discussed this topic in the most recent episode of our podcast. Now, I said 2023 because whilst Red Bull had the most dominant car in F1 history, it still takes an exceptional driver to be extracting the most from it week in, week out, which he did to make it the most dominant season by any driver, by any team. And actually, you've only got to look at the other side of the Red Bull garage at Sergio Perez, who had the same car as Max Verstappen, yet was still being knocked out in Q2, Q1, still struggling to finish in the top five. So for me, that's why I said 2023. Ian, lead editor in Parks, if I'm right in saying, also agreed with me on 2023, yes. But you had a different view, if I remember correctly.
I did, and just on your opinion as well, I think you're bang on the Perez stuff, because we look at the championship. Oh yeah, P2, but he only just got second, which just shows, in contrast, how good Max was last year.
Yeah.
So my opinion is slightly different. I think you can split 2024 versus 2021. I think 2024 was his best. I think that's him at his best. I think obviously 2023 was so dominant, but he didn't need to be firing all cylinders at all times. But I think 2021 was his greatest. An easy way of explaining this, I think the 2024 version of Max Verstappen would have wrapped up the 2021 championship sooner than he did. And so ultimately, yes, I think this is Max at his best. But I personally feel that 2021 was a bigger achievement. It was a bigger hurdle to overcome. And I think really it was what set him on this path that he is now on. I think, it was as I said, a huge obstacle, and he got past it, and we're now seeing one of the most, and potentially the greatest F1 driver when all is said and done, but certainly one of the most dominant that the sport has ever seen.
Well, I think it's really interesting as well. So when we look at Max's 4 titles, and Ian pointed this out actually in the podcast and in the post-race F1 update, that all 4 of Max's titles have been so different. Of course, 2021 will, rightly or wrongly, and not through his own fault, always be remembered for the controversy in Abu Dhabi, which is something that actually was completely out of Max's control, had nothing to do with him, but yet it's still his title then that gets tarnished because of that. You then look at 2022, and obviously Ferrari came out the blocks quickly. Charles Leclerc had a lead. Red Bull overcome it with Max, and obviously Ferrari ultimately bottled it in the end on several occasions. 2023 was just dominant from start to finish. And then this year, Red Bull have ridden the roller coaster. They've ride the wave. And Max has been dominant when he needed to be, but at the same time has then extracted the most from the RB20 when it hasn't been the best car. But what's really interesting, and Ian summed it up brilliantly, that this is the kind of question that should be answered in the pub around a table with drinks in hand, because it's such a debate. And just to prove that point, we actually ran a poll on the Racing News 365 website asking our readers, which of Max's 4 titles do you think is his greatest? And actually, 47% of those who voted did say 2024, 34% said 2021, 17% said 2023, and just 2% said 2022. So actually a really interesting spread, I think. And Rent, a brilliant question. I think something we'll probably discuss again, not just over the winter break, but actually over the coming years as well, when we look back, even when Max retires, when we look back at his career. Next question comes from Marin. What team will be the favourites in Qatar this weekend based on the layout and the temperature? Marin thinks it'll be McLaren or Ferrari.
So this, again, a brilliant question, because it gets into the brilliance and the beauty of F1 in 2024. It's just so unpredictable. Mercedes didn't know why they were so strong in Vegas. And so we can anticipate, we can predict, but you never really know who's going to be strongest on any given weekend until you get there, because things like weather, climate, they will have an effect. And Qatar, last year, we saw extreme temperatures. Obviously, it's later in the year in 2024 that we're going to the Middle Eastern country. So that will have an effect. We're actually expecting quite cool conditions.
Mid-20s.
Which could, it'll make life much easier for the drivers, but could play into the likes of Mercedes' hands. But what we are expecting is that it will be McLaren. We think the track layout is a much more of a McLaren circuit. Ferrari are anticipating to struggle. Carlos Sainz himself said over the weekend, we could be 5th or 6th, fastest in terms of the 2 drivers, not 5th or 6th fastest team. That would be quite the fall off. But they're anticipating a kind of McLaren-like weekend, the one that McLaren suffered in Vegas, whereas McLaren themselves are anticipating that Qatar and Abu Dhabi will be a much more, McLaren comfortable circuit. However, there is always the spoiler in the pack. This could sound really harsh. The one-man band, fighting one-handed Max Verstappen. He could insert himself with no pressure of the driver's title. He could insert himself in the Constructors' Championship. He could take points off the table for one of those teams. So there's no guarantee that Max isn't going to be in that fight as well. So I think it's certainly McLaren's to lose in Qatar, but it very much depends on the weather conditions we get once we get to the weekend.
Yeah, and I agree. I think McLaren will be the strongest in Qatar. At least that's what kind of most teams have been saying. And also you look at how strong McLaren were at the Losail International Circuit last season. But what's really interesting is that it was my bold prediction in the podcast that I think McLaren will steal the Constructors' title in Qatar. At the same time, they could even fall behind Ferrari into second. Lando himself, though, actually thinks Red Bull are going to be really, really strong. And this just shows, though, that in this season, at the moment in F1, you just cannot predict anything. And if you do predict something correctly, then, well, you can call my next lottery numbers, please, because you're quite, okay, all right. Let's go on to the final question. Marin, thank you very much for your question. And this one, Sam, I think we can both answer as well. It comes from Gus. And if you look at 2025, which 3 drivers do you think have the best potential to be world champion based on the fact that everyone's kind of expecting Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes to be so close together next year?
Another lovely question, one that really gets us, we can get our teeth into, and it allows me to hark back to one of my boldest predictions.
Here we go.
So a nice segue. That I said around the British Grand Prix that I thought George Russell would win the driver's title next year. So I'd be remiss if I didn't include him in my 3. I think he is stepping forward. I said at the time that he needs to show what he can do. He needs to progress over the second half of the season. I think he is showing that. I think Vegas was a good example of how he is matured and how he's a more measured, more stable pair of hands than he maybe was in the past. I think he's ready to lead that Mercedes team. I think it's down to now to Mercedes to deliver that car. So I'm going to put George in there, but he's a bit of a wild card entry because I do worry about Mercedes' ability to deliver with what we assume will be called the W16 consistently. Exactly. You can't discount Max Verstappen. You can never discount Max.
Okay, that's 2.
So that's
one left.
2.
You have one left, and I'll give my 3. So,
but this is brutal because I've got to choose. Okay, I'll choose a. I've got both McLaren drivers and both Ferrari drivers that I haven't chosen yet. Kimi Antonelli and Sergio Perez aren't a factor, I don't think, yet at this point.
Tough call.
I'm going to go in my. I'm torn between Lewis. I think Charles will give him a good run for his money, but I think Lewis will be that de facto leader of Ferrari. I'm torn between him and Oscar. I think he'll be Oscar Piastri. I think he'll take a step forward ahead of Lando next year and, be the one that kind of takes McLaren forward in that drivers' championship fight. So I'm going to go Oscar Piastri, but I feel very nervous about it.
Okay, so you're saying George, Max, Oscar. I'm going to say Max, Oscar, Lando. I think McLaren, the second half of this year, despite what happened in Vegas, have had the best car. If you look at it, for probably McLaren have probably the best car for more rounds than they haven't this season when you look at the season in a whole. And I think the odds are they're going to probably continue that going into next season. For me, Ferrari, Charles Leclerc, I think, just doesn't have the consistency to fight for a championship at the moment. I think Lewis is too difficult to see how he's going to set into Ferrari. Is he going to enjoy, not living in the UK, for example? I know he lives in different places around the world, but I think being based in Italy is going to be something very different. He's not experienced. And, McLaren, I think when you look at Max, as you pointed out, you can never bet against, because even if Red Bull have a bad car, which they have done for several rounds this season, he's still being in at least podium contention. McLaren, whilst I don't think Lando or Oscar are in the top 2 for best drivers on the grid, I think McLaren will be able to perform consistently enough over a season to ensure that both drivers can fight for the driver's title. The bigger question then is whether Lando and Oscar can not make mistakes themselves and perform consistently, which is actually, it's the same thing when you look at so many drivers. When you look at George, Charles, Lewis, Checo, there's no point really involving this conversation because who knows if he'll even be there next year. But Max is the only but Max is the only one though who does do it on a consistent basis, week in, week out, good car, bad car.
And the evidence of that is in the fact that from Miami onwards, he has extended his championship lead over Lando Norris by 10 points. And that just shows, and we talked about it, so much on the podcast about how measured, mature, and just how much he's progressed as a driver. And that could be the key to unlocking a 5th consecutive title in a car that isn't quite on a par to, say, the Ferrari or the McLaren.
I agree. And thank you to all those fans who sent in questions. And of course, make sure if you want us to answer your questions in the future, after every race, a post goes live on the racingnews365.com Instagram page. That's where we have a little story up. We can type in your questions. We then answer them. Bish, bash, bosh. You can then have your questions feature on our fan questions video. This has been Racing News 365. Answers your post Las Vegas fan questions. From myself and Sam, we'll see you this weekend in Qatar. See you later.
Thanks for joining us.